Hello, time for another Man and Great book for you. Today's book is William the Fourth, A King at Sea by Roger Knight, published in 2015 by Penguin Books. It's 94 pages. This is part of the Penguin Monarch series. This is a series of short biographies of all the British and English monarchs up until and including Elizabeth II. Now, William the Fourth is one of the more obscure British monarchs. He reigned for almost exactly 7 years, from 1830 to 1837, and he has certainly been overshadowed by his successor and niece, Queen Victoria, who was, of course, one of the longest reigning monarchs in European history. But even though William's reign was rather brief, it was very eventful. Among other things, slavery was abolished during this time period throughout the British colonies. There was a major reform to Britain's poor laws, the laws that put people in workhouses, which, of course, Charles Dickens is famous for writing about. And most significantly of all, the parliamentary boroughs were redistributed, and the number of people who were able to vote in elections was expanded due to the passage of the Reform Act of 1832. Probably the single most important thing that occurred during William's reign, and I'll talk about the Reform Act in more detail later. Now, William was never expected to be king. He was the third son of King George II. His elder brothers George and Frederick were in line before him, and so he was never really trained in court etiquette or brought up in the way you're supposed to behave as a monarch, and he showed almost no interest in politics and the political situation. And as a result, when he finally did become king, kind of unexpectedly, he really wasn't prepared for it, and it really made a mark on his reign. He was popular with the masses, but not particularly popular with the politicians who had to deal with him. And he had a reputation, even before he became king, of being rather dumb and lazy. Although modern historians of the monarchy have given him more credit, he did modify his behavior a little bit and worked he made an attempt anyway to try to bridge the gap between the Whig Party and the Tory Party, who were loggerheads during his entire reign. When William was a boy, he had a reputation of being hot-headed and a bad temper, and his father, George II, decided that he needed the discipline and order of the Navy. And so as a 13-year-old, he was put out to sea, and the idea that he would, go through have a naval career. And his father, George II, made it clear that he didn't want his son to have any special treatment, but of course he was the son of a monarch, and so he did get special treatment. The king was unrealistic in that way. And William had a 10-year-long career in the Navy, and to put it charitably, it was rather undistinguished. He, as a sailor, he spent a lot of his time drinking and gambling, and when he was on shore, he spent much of his time seeking out brothels and prostitutes. And when he was given authority over ships, he tended to be something of a martinet. He was obsessed with minor rules and regulations. He liked to flog people for the very lame pretenses. And he wasn't very popular with his fellow officers because, being the son of the king, he held himself above other officers and kind of looked down his nose at them. And eventually, even his father, George II, realized he wasn't cut out for sea duty and made sure that he was spent time on land, and so he didn't participate in any of the major battles with the French during that time period. He also had a great deal of difficulty with finances because, among other things, William was a compulsive gambler, and he liked to live way above his station. His father gave him an allowance to live on, but he burned through that pretty quickly, and his father was reluctant to give him more money because he figured correctly that William would just waste it. So William went in search of a wealthy woman to kind of sponge off of, and he found that woman in an Irish actress whose name was Dorothea Bland, who went by the stage name Mrs. Jordan. And they were together. William and Dorothea Bland were together for 20 years, and he fathered 10 children with her, none of whom, of course, were eligible for the throne because they were all illegitimate. And she basically supported him through her acting for much of their time together. But as she got older, the roles started to dry up, and William began to lose interest in his aging mistress and began to look elsewhere. And eventually, they broke up in 1811, and he arranged to have a stipend for her to live on, but his rules were that she had to leave the stage because he didn't want her acting, because everybody knew that they'd had all these kids together, and he wanted her to kind of retreat into obscurity and live a quiet life. But in 1814, she went back on stage because her brother was heavily in debt, and she needed money to try to help pay off his debt. So she went back on stage. And when William found out about this, he cut off her allowance, her stipend. And then she fled to France to try to escape creditors. And then, unfortunately, the little money she had left was spent by one of her daughters, who basically embezzled money from her. And she wound up, sadly, Dorothea Bland wound up dying in 1816 alone and impoverished in France. Meanwhile, William began searching for a woman to marry. He needed two things. He needed a woman with a rich dowry to support him until he became king, and he needed a woman to give him a legitimate successor. And he wound up marrying Adelaide of Saxe. Let me make sure I get the name right here. Meinhausen. Yeah, Adelaide of Saxe-Meinhausen, who was a woman who actually was quite compatible. They had a happy marriage, but there were two problems. One is she failed to give him an heir. She had two daughters, both of whom died in infancy, and she had several miscarriages, wasn't able to produce an heir. And she was heavily influenced by her brother, who was an extreme right-wing Tory, and she tried to, when William became king, tried to interfere with his delicate maneuverings to trying to get a compromise between the political parties. And he eventually kind of shunted her aside because he didn't like her interfering with his politics. So anyway, so his personal life was quite messy, and his life until he became king was rather that of a failure. He really didn't succeed politically, didn't succeed as a sailor, and he certainly didn't succeed much as a father. But he was lucky in that his brother, who became King George III, was not very healthy and was overweight, and eventually, of course, died. And then, but before that happened, the second in line, Prince Frederick, also died. Frederick died in 1827, and so in 1830, William suddenly found himself king, and in his 60s. So it was, and so everybody was kind of worried about what kind of king he would be because he had this terrible reputation, being erratic in his behavior and a gambler and hot-tempered. But when he became king, he kind of settled down. His wife helped him settle down. He got his finances in order, and he began to become more a responsible king, and he was quite popular with the people. Now, his major accomplishment, as I said, was the major accomplishment occurred during his reign was the passing of the Reform Act, and this of 1832. So what was going on during this time period? Of course, you had the early days of the Industrial Revolution. Many people were leaving the farms and going into towns and cities. Factories were beginning to be built. England and Scotland were becoming major textile industries. But the laws that set up the Parliament were still based on kind of medieval times. Many of the cities had no representation at all. Most people couldn't vote. You had to be a large landowner in order to have any votes. And so people began to clamor for change. And there was a real feeling for a while there that England might go through a revolution like what had happened in France. During William's reign, the King of France was overthrown in what became known as the Glorious Revolution. It was a bloodless coup. He wasn't executed like Louis XVI was earlier, but there was a real feeling that the masses might rise up because they were upset over paying taxes and not having representation, if that sounds familiar to Americans. And so the House of Commons came up with this reform bill, which expanded the voting rights to shopkeepers and small landowners, and it eliminated some of the old voting boroughs in the countryside, which had depopulated as many people left the farms and began moving to cities. And so it was expanding the vote and expanding the political power of the middle classes that were developing in the cities. But the House of Lords, well, first of all, the law passed overwhelmingly in the House of Commons, but it was blocked by the House of Lords. And so there was a pressure on, and this happened not once, not twice, but three times. And so the pressure began to be put on William to expand the number of lords in the House of Lords because he could appoint lords. And so this law would get passed. Well, at first he was reluctant to do that. One of the things William was known for is he was stubborn and was suspicious of change, but he was more flexible than both his successors, George II and George III. And eventually he gave in and allowed more lords to be appointed, and eventually the reform bill passed. And he became very popular with all these people in the cities because suddenly they were able to vote and the taxes were reapportioned so that the tax burden on these people was less and so forth. But this marked not only did this mark a change in the voting, it also marked a milestone in British political history because now the House of Commons began to assert authority and began to grow in importance while the House of Lords began to decline in importance. And of course, that continues until today, where the House of Lords is completely insignificant. They can't block any legislation. They're really just a bunch of figureheads that don't really do anything. And so all that began under William's reign. So even though his reign was brief, it was important, and he did turn out to be a fairly effective king despite all of his personal faults. At the end of the book, there's an interesting little quotation by one of William's sisters, who said that William does well when he bothers to assert himself. When he gets interested in something and makes an effort, he does well, but most of the time he's too lazy and indifferent to do anything. And so that's why he was a fairly mediocre monarch. Not a terrible monarch, not nearly as bad as King John or some of the others, but certainly not a shining example of what the monarchy could be. So if you're interested in this interesting and very important time period of British history, and you don't want to read a long biography of William, this book, which of course is less than 100 pages, should fit the bill. The book is William IV, A King at Sea. The author is Roger Knight. This has been another Man in Gray book review. Thanks for watching.